We lost in Rotterdam because of us, not because they were better.
H2K have fallen apart at the seams in these team fights.
I think we improved a lot since the last split. And I'm not saying about like our individual performances either, I'm just saying like overall as a team.
Get the ace, kill the base, H2K, cool journey, Rocket will be sent back to the fountain.
It was quite tough for me to play with support that's not Yellowstar.
Yellowstar is back to Europe and he will probably show us.
North America was definitely a great experience. I'm not regretting it at all. I feel more comfortable in Europe. I'm way more happier here, so, you know.
Beat me up, Scotty. Yellowstar making his way on the front line.
I still think that in TSM, people just didn't trust him, that's why he didn't look so good.
An insane performance, and one that Fnatic can be proud of.
They're gonna be really strong.
I bring like a more team-oriented play style into H2K.
Steelback's gone really deep, he's taken Steelback down.
I don't think he's better than Forgiven, but I think he's still an upgrade.
We will see more optimal ways to play the game. It's going to be crazy.
Welcome to the LCS studios in Berlin, Germany, where we're at the halfway point in week 2 of the summer split. And with all the shakeups across the league, anything can happen once we get on the Rift. You're getting a look at the action on the ground, where our fans were lining up a little while ago. Our cosplayers are here once again as well, super amped up, as well as Rocket setting up on stage in the studio, and Splice getting amped as well before their game versus G2 Esports. Of course, G2 yesterday dropping a game, so we'll see what happens today. Good evening, I'm EpicSkillshot supporter, ready to cover all of today's matchups with the help of James Stress O'Leary, Andy Vedius Day, and Trevor Quickshot Henry. Nailed that, although I said Trevor instead of Trevor.
It's okay, he doesn't mind.
It's okay. Let's take a look at what is really important, the standings. Obviously, we now have 2 teams in first place. G2 is joined by Fnatic, and OG is finally on the board with 1 point, and they're in third place, tied Splice after a 2-0 win over Schalke.
You could say it's a bit of a surprise, but it shows you what a dominating victory does. 2-0 gets you those 3 points, jumps Splice right up in the standings. It's been a good start for the young squad in the summer split.
It's going to be fun to see how the tables progress throughout the split for teams who are unable to pick up those convincing 2-0s. But I think the biggest story of yesterday's games is just how messy some of those games were. It is a new patch, there were a lot of new champions, but overall, things just felt a bit sloppy, a bit rough around the edges, and I'm hoping for it to be cleaner.
Yeah, we have to be honest about that. The level was not high in most of the games we saw yesterday, and as you mentioned, a lot of new picks, 11 new picks here in week 2, Vedius, Ilaoi, Anivia, Yasuo, Kha'Zix.
While it is fun to see a lot of these new picks, not all of them were quite as optimally used as we would have liked to see. The Ilaoi, for one, putting it in that style of composition, not really the optimal way to play her, but hopefully moving forward and with a lot of changes in this patch, team will get a little bit better at using these new picks, and we'll see better play out of them.
And to take a look at some of the picks that maybe are a little more commonly expected now, I think those 4 picks, some we'll see again, but some will drop off. The Zyra is the one that I want to pick up on the bottom lane. We're seeing a big shift in supports now, a lot of damage coming from that, a lot of crowd control, expecting to see more Zyra, especially paired with that Ashe.
If we have to give up a little bit of the level of play to see these crazy picks, I don't mind, actually. So we'll see what happens today as the meta madness continues with Splice and G2 going at it in the LCS arena or on stream EU LCS 1, while Vitality and Rocket start the day in the studio on EU LCS 2. Now, later on, Schalke go up against Origin, but not before our match of the week between H2K and Fnatic, who are just 2 points apart in the standings, and Fnatic are now defending their #1 spot.
They are defending the #1 spot, and I think they're the favorite going into that series. I think if you look at Fnatic's wins from yesterday, they were very convincing. They punished their opponents' mistakes very well. And H2K were a little sloppy against Giants. You know, Giants, they remained as this death ball. They gave H2K challenges, and I still keep expecting more from H2K. I wonder at what point do they start kicking in, if they even can.
Yeah, do you guys think H2K might win it?
Oh, it's a tough one. I think Fnatic been looking stronger. We've heard so much about Yellowstar, but maybe that's a broken record. We're 2 weeks in, people are still saying, hey, he's back.
I think the jungle matchup will actually be quite an interesting one to keep our eyes on. Spirit versus Jankos. We know Jankos... last week, he had a very incredible kill participation in terms of setting up a lot of his team's plays. Is he going to be able to do that against these aggressive picks that we're seeing from Spirit?
It's going to be a super, super hype matchup. It is our, series of the week, match of the week. For me, on the other stream, there is an important matchup going on at the same time, Giants and Unicorns. If you get a 2-0 in that, get 3 points, could very well have big implications for later on in the split.
Yeah, definitely could. And of course, at the end of the day, it is the post-game lobby where we'll break down all of the series today and look forward to week 3 of the summer split with our special guest Freeze from H2K. Now, with a lot of big performances on the Rift so far this summer, we want to hear from you. Get on Twitter and tell us, who do you think is the most underrated player in the EU LCS and why?
I personally actually think Kikis coming in. A lot of people were thinking he's just going to be this tank up in the top lane. There's not going to get very many resources. Just going to basically be the sponge for G2 while the big superstars and perks in the bottom lane really shine to the top. But he's bringing out Irelia, he's bringing out Fizz, and I feel like he is having a big impact in the top lane for G2.
I think for me, one of the players I'm looking at from Splice, I know Deficio will get tilted by hearing this, is Cobby. And I'll reason it by saying Deficio and a lot of us at the desk have looked at a lot of performances and said he's good, but everybody else is still not looking at this guy. I think a lot of people have got to take more notice of that.
He put himself on the map since yesterday.
I'm looking at Mickey, I'm looking at Trashy, I'm looking at Wonder, so I think it's fair that, you know, Cobby's there to clean up, and he's good enough to not get caught out, so it's like praise to the guy.
Yeah, indeed. Already a couple of player of the game votes as well. Be sure to hit us up at LOL Esports and include the hashtag EULCS. Remember, tell us who you think is the most underrated player in EULCS so far. However, time to get into that matchup and get into Splice that we just mentioned, as they will be going up against G2 Esports. Yesterday, what a performance they had up against Schalke. We thought it might be a tie, but they did incredibly well in those team fights and just cleanly took Schalke down.
They certainly did. Yesterday's game with Splice, they look like a, well, I don't want to say new team because they showed a very similar performance last week, but compared to their spring split performance, they have definitely been stepping up. What's impressed me the most is after every small pick that they've been able to find, they've immediately turned it into an objective, and I think that is the big shift that we've seen compared to them in spring split.
And one of the nice things for a team like Splice, when you can look at their spring split performances versus summer with this one change, they're making less mistakes, and because they're making less mistakes, they're not being punished. Whereas they are punishing their opponent's mistakes, which is something that you are afforded when you play clean, when you play safe. So a lot of credit to the squad after revamping in the offseason.
And I think that's where a good mismatch of styles comes in here, because G2 yesterday, they took their first loss against Rockcat, and we talk about Splice, good team fighting, punishing mistakes. Well, if you want to beat G2, seems like that's the way to go, because yesterday, although, you know, game 1 was pretty good for G2, they couldn't deal with Rockat's team fighting that followed. It was those late game decisions where Perks was going in, the rest of the team wasn't quite there to follow up with him, and, you know, G2 just didn't quite look comfortable with this adapted style with the Irelia. So I now wonder, looking at a game against Splice, how these two match up, because it could very well be the weakness that lets them down against the young squad that mostly are from Denmark.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because last week, Crepo was talking so much about how when G2 was setting up around things like the Baron, like these big late game objectives, they weren't really setting up properly, and the way in which they executed was always not as good as it could have been. And going up against these better teams, you have to be wary about how easily you can get punished. So G2 showing a bit of weakness in week 2.
Yeah, we saw a bit of that Rockcat team fighting, and they're up against Vitality, setting up in the studio right now. And it is a team fighting that has done incredibly well for them, obviously. It seems like when they do get their early game together, it then doesn't work for them late. If they get their team fighting right, then they're making up for something from the early game. So all the ducks are not in a row.
As we said with yesterday's game, you could take the first half of game 1, the second half of game 2,
perfect.
put them together, and you had a great game from Rockcat. But you can see there, overall from yesterday, still not doing so well in the early game. Even though Airwax had some good plays in the first game, it's just not all around for Rockcat, and they need to fix that if they want to go up against the top teams here in Europe.
Yeah, up against Vitality, who has also only given us ties, and Rockcat as well. So maybe one of these two squads can get ahead here.
What impressed both Deficio and I on the desk yesterday was actually how in game 1, their draft was pretty phenomenal against Origin, because they seemed to know exactly what Origin were going to do, and they picked perfectly to play into that. And they had, while it was a slow game, it was still a very well executed game. Moving into game 2, though, the draft was not as good as it could have been.
And this is a problem, because last week they also opted into that last pick LeBlanc, into a team composition that naturally itemizes and is somewhat of a counter to LeBlanc. It fell behind early, and look, you put all your eggs in a basket, win early, then win game. Fine, I understand that. But there were so many flaws in the approach. With these hit and miss pick and ban strategies, I think it's a little bit unacceptable. I think this is a team that's been together for a long time. They've got a lot of talent. And that's something where you can instantly give yourself an advantage with the caliber of players that Vitality have.
And you could see how that decision-making in the pregame in the draft influenced the rest of the game, because the games were very slow yesterday.
Yeah.
They didn't have the tools to create their own destiny in those games. It was like, well, if Origin make a mistake, we can punish really well. But in game 2 especially, there were situations where Vitality looked like they couldn't do anything on the map because of their composition. They did not know how to play like that.
Yeah, coming into this week, they had the slowest wins and the fastest losses. Yesterday, they also had a very slow loss, and knowing that Rocket knows what to do when they get to late game, that might be a problem.
It definitely can, especially if Betsy continues to put on the performance that he has throughout the course of the mid to late game. I think Betsy is a player that once the map is open up and once he's got his teammates around him, he really starts to shine. It was the same last week, it was the same yesterday. So it is a real concern, and it's very interesting that Rocket could be a very legitimate threat to Vitality. That is not something I actually expected to say coming into the split.
No, but it's very nice for us. And without further ado, it is time to send things over to our casters and get on the Rift.
Thank you, Sharks. Hello, everyone.